Welcome back, Counterpunchers. Another conversation for you. Always happy to chat, always happy to bring on interesting guests who have a lot to contribute to our conversations here. One of those is with me today. I'm very happy to welcome Nate Wilcox onto Counterpunch. Nate Wilcox is the editor-in-chief at the MMA Draw. Find the MMA Draw over at Substack. In case you don't know Nate, he is the founder of BloodyElbow.com. He's an influential MMA journalist. He was also an early political blogger in the 2000s, co-wrote the book Netroots Rising, all about progressive activism online in the early 2000s, a book many of us are probably already familiar with. So Nate, welcome to Counterpunch.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
Thank you so much for coming on to talk with us. So, Nate, you've been covering MMA, mixed martial arts, for quite a number of years now. And so I think it would probably make sense for us to start with some MMA. Why would I be talking about MMA to a Counterpunch audience here where most people are probably not that interested in the sport itself? Well, because we are recording here on June 9th, just a few days out from the UFC's so-called Freedom card, or the UFC White House event, spectacle, whatever you want to call it. So I guess we'll just start at the very basic level. Nate, tell us about the event, how this has come about, why you think this is coming about now.
Well, UFC Freedom 250, as it's called, is being held on the White House lawn. It's the first sporting event to ever do so. It's the first UFC event to be held on public lands like this in the United States. It's only the second UFC event ever to be held outdoors. It's one of very few to be held on a Sunday. Sometimes they have events in Australia that are on Sundays, but generally for American audiences, they've only had one or two cards ever on a Sunday. It's a 7-card fight, which is much less than their normal. So it's a very unusual event for the UFC. It features an American fighter in the main event, but he's not the champion. He's the challenger, and he's heavily underdog against the Spanish Georgian fighter Ilia Topuria. So they had a hard time scraping up American fighters for what some have called America's birthday, but it's actually Donald Trump's 80th birthday and Flag Day. And according to Dana White, the idea for this originated with Donald Trump in 2024 as they were sitting octagon side, I believe at the event in New Jersey, when Donald Trump had earlier been indicted on 34 felony accounts and made his first public appearance at the UFC to a very favorable response from the crowd, which he has not enjoyed in his most recent appearance at a UFC event in Florida, where they had to turn the mics down. It's unclear if there was booing or just not a lot of response, but as the polls have shown, he's lost a lot of the support from the youth demographic that put him over the top in 2024. As to why this is happening, I mean, it's got to be an element of aggrandizement for Trump. It's a huge promotional opportunity for the UFC. If you look at Google Trends, they're getting more news coverage than they've ever received in their history, at least through 2004 when we have Google Trends data. It's entirely possible that in the 1990s, when they were being called human cockfighting and John McCain was personally calling the governor of every state trying to get them banned, they might have gotten more news coverage than this. And similarly, I'm not sure if it's a net benefit for the promotion, as most of the news coverage I've seen has been from what Dana White might call hand-wringing liberals, who are appalled at the barbarism of people are comparing it to the Roman gladiators and that kind of thing, saying that they're disgracing the people's house. Even some UFC fighters are saying that they're disgracing the people's house with this. So it's a very interesting promotional mix. It also came out recently that Donald Trump is a direct investor in TKO, the parent company that owns the UFC, although his stake is relatively small. But as we know from Trump, personal profit is definitely a key motivator with Trump. So many times when you're trying to figure out what is this crazy man doing, there's a profit motive in it for him or his family. So that appears to be consistent. And yesterday, the New York Post reported that Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Dana White are announcing a deal for the State Department and the UFC to work together to use the UFC events for diplomacy. And again, nobody knows the details of this, but I would assume if I were a betting man, I would bet there's a big government handout going to TKO along with that agreement to do diplomacy via the cage fighting.
We're going to get into TKO here in a couple of minutes because I'm almost certain very few people know what that corporation is, what they own, how influential they are. So we're going to get to that. But Nate, you mentioned the name Dana White. He's a public figure that many people, of course, would know, even if you know nothing about MMA. But for those who maybe don't know who Dana White is, or just know him as that bald guy who does the cage fighting thing, tell us a little bit about Dana White, who he is, and why he matters in this political context.
Well, Dana White is the face of the UFC. He's become synonymous with the UFC. They've had a strategy for the entire time he's been involved with the promotion to elevate Dana White as the face of the promotion ahead of any particular fighter, much the way the WWE for years elevated Vince McMahon as the face of the promotion rather than any particular wrestler. It's a great way to keep salaries down. And also, promoters are going to have much longer careers than fighters on average because there's less brain damage involved. Dana White became involved in the UFC when he convinced some friends of his from high school to buy the promotion for a few $1,000,000 in the early 2000s. They'd been struggling ever since John McCain had gotten them successfully banned from most pay-per-view events. I mean, when they launched in 1993, it was an immediate success, doing what at the time were record numbers for pay-per-view. But by the late 90s, they were having a very hard time finding venues, very hard time getting on pay-per-view and making revenue. And so Dana and his friends, the Fertitta brothers, Lorenzo and Frank Fertitta, owned station casinos. They're Las Vegas gambling billionaires, Las Vegas royalty, in fact, whose family, whose father was a big player in Las Vegas and whose grandfather was a big player in Galveston back when that was an illegal gambling haven in the carpet joint days of the 50s. So Dana became the front man for the promotion. By all accounts, he's heavily involved in the mastermind behind their TV production, but he was never the main fight booker. A guy named Joe Silva is the guy who probably deserves the credit for doing the matchmaking that built the UFC. And Lorenzo Fertitta was the business genius behind the promotion's success. It was Lorenzo Fertitta's idea to buy time on Spike TV, which got them the Ultimate Fighter reality series in 2005, which became the breakthrough hit that broke the UFC finally in the mainstream in the United States. Dana White stayed with the company when they sold to Ari Emanuel's Endeavor Group in 2016. It's now called TKO after they bought the WWE in 2023. Also, Endeavor, which is most famous as a Hollywood talent agency. Sometimes it's currently called the WME Group because it's William Morris Endeavor. William Morris being one of our most storied Hollywood agencies going back to the 1800s. Emanuel was acquired, his company Endeavor was acquired by WME in 2009. There was a corporate dust up, and somehow Ari Emanuel came out as the chairman of the board of the WME Endeavor combined group at the end of that. So this guy's an incredibly effective inside power player. And Endeavor had to go private. It nearly went bankrupt in 2020 during COVID. And it was literally saved because the UFC cut a deal with the United Arab Emirates to keep holding fights during COVID on what they called Fight Island, and defied every health expert at the time, although it was perfectly in sync with the policies the Biden administration would later adopt. Get your shot and forget about it, and go on about your business. But that literally saved Ari Emanuel's entire empire. They have since taken Endeavor private, which a company called Silver Lake, run by a guy named Egan Durbin, masterminded that. He did the same thing for Dell Computer, where he took Dell private and then later put it back on the public offering. And coincidentally, Donald Trump is also a big investor in Dell Computer, and he was touting Dell earlier this year, apropos of nothing seemingly, and then later reveals that, oh yeah, I just bought a big chunk of shares in Dell, and that's why I'm talking them up so much. And so that's sort of a pocket history of TKO. They bought WWE in 2023, spun UFC and WWE out into this new entity cleverly called TKO, and now they're forming an entity called Zuffa Boxing, wherein they are lobbying to change the laws of boxing so that they could potentially monopolize boxing in the same way that the UFC was basically a monopoly when they bought it, and the WWE essentially is a monopoly when it was purchased by Endeavor as well.
So much more to say about TKO. Let's take 3 steps back. I just want to return to this Dana White issue because there's another story that's been circulating in advance of this White House nonsense. This mythology that's been created seemingly out of whole cloth. This idea that Dana White and the UFC and Donald Trump are somehow like friends from the glory days, and that Donald Trump is the savior of the UFC who rode in on a stallion to save this fledgling promotion. All of this total bullshit. Can you give us a little bit of the real story here? I mean, you just gave us some of that, but why are they spinning this mythology now, obviously ahead of this card? And how fraudulent is this?
Well, they've been spinning this since 2016 when Dana White suddenly became a politically vocal figure. Prior to 2016, Dana White had been a pretty anodyne, low key donor to politicians, mainly Democratic, because Nevada is a Democratic state. That he, along with their Fertittas, would give money to Harry Reid. They kept things on, they wanted to be apolitical. Their goal was to appeal to as many people as possible. The goal of the UFC at the time was to be the biggest sports this side of soccer. They wanted to literally be the world's biggest sport. They punished fighters for homophobic remarks, for rape jokes, for transphobic remarks. They tried to keep everything buttoned down and corporate. But then, coincidentally, around the time Emanuel buys the company in 2016 and Trump starts running for office, suddenly Dana White and Donald Trump are best friends. Now, it's true that Donald Trump hosted an early Zuffa UFC event in the early 2000s in one of his New Jersey casinos. And that was a solid for them. I mean, they were not desperate for venues at that point, but it was a relatively prestigious event. And he had connections with the New Jersey Athletic Commission, which is a relatively prestigious athletic commission, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also true that by 2009, Donald Trump was the face of Affliction, which you might remember as the winged skull t-shirt company that was big with bros in the 2000s. Affliction was a t-shirt company that got really big off of the UFC by promoting, sponsoring fighters back when companies were allowed to do that, and then ultimately decided to compete with the UFC and put on two massive pay-per-view events and attempted a third. And they were bitter, hated enemies of the UFC. And Dana White's on the record making fun of Donald Trump as part of his, general promotional trash talk against Affliction. So this idea that Donald Trump somehow saved the UFC, total hokum. The idea that Donald Trump and Dana White are bros from way back, also total hokum. The relationship basically appears out of nowhere in 2016 when suddenly the UFC takes this political right turn. Suddenly Dana White is an outspoken Republican and advocate of Trump. He tries to say he's not political and this is only because of his personal relationship with Trump, but there's no indication he truly has a personal relationship with Trump. I mean, obviously they spent a lot of time together. I mean, he was at the infamous dinner with Bill Maher and Kid Rock and things like that. So to a certain degree, Dana White is in the Trump inner circle, but there's just as much or more evidence that Ari Emanuel is the real player in the Trump inner circle. Ari Emanuel was an agent for Donald Trump before he owned the UFC. He might have been involved in Donald Trump's landing The Apprentice, which is why Donald Trump is president for a number of reasons, not just least of which because there's some evidence that the only reason he ran for president in 2016 was to enhance his bargaining status with the producers of The Apprentice. He just wanted to get out there, show them how strong he was in the polls and say, now give me the money I want. Not to get too sidetracked, but the guy who had been producing The Apprentice had moved to CNN. And suddenly Donald Trump was much more valuable to that dude as a candidate. CNN that year infamously ran 26, 36 Trump rallies in full, where they ran 0 Bernie Sanders rallies, which were getting much bigger crowds. So, everybody's swept along in these events as Donald Trump runs for president and unexpectedly wins. Dana White introduces him at the Republican National Convention. But there's no proof that Dana and Donald have any kind of super close relationship. But there is a lot of evidence that Ari Emanuel and Donald Trump have a close relationship. For example, it came out in the press that when Ticketmaster and Live Nation were having their most recent court hearing, that Ari Emanuel personally called Donald Trump and asked him to weigh in favor of one of the most hated monopolies in the United States. So, yeah, it's a fascinating. Are you familiar with the term kayfabe, the pro wrestling term?
Oh, of course. But tell the audience what kayfabe means.
Kayfabe is an old school thing back when people pretended pro wrestling was real. In the 1800s, pro wrestling was generally real. The matches were real. But once radio came along, the matches were too long. And so they started fixing them or working them. And then that became more and more show business, and they would have good guys and bad guys rather than just athletes. They would have these over the top personalities, and they would pretend that they were bitter enemies. So a scandal in pro wrestling in the 1980s was when something like a good guy wrestler and a bad guy wrestler had a fender bender, and they were in a car together at the same time because they were traveling together because they were roommates and friends. But oh my God, you had to keep kayfabe and pretend that, Commander Cody and the Iron Sheik were bitter enemies and really hated each other. Vince McMahon ended all of that when he no longer wanted to mess with athletic commissions and just came out and said, this is a performance. This is scripted. This is fake. But since then, the term kayfabe has entered into the lexicon as, when you're pretending to do something that's not real, and it's deep in fight sports of all kinds.
Oh yeah, kayfabe. Actually, if I recall correctly, the term goes back to the carnival days, the old carnival barker days, and that then is brought forward because many of the original promoters of boxing and wrestling were former carnival workers and people who were from that world, and so a lot of the terminology sort of evolved into the combat sports world from that. By the way, just as a separate side note recommendation, great book on that history called Ballyhoo, which I would recommend to everybody. Uh,
Excellent book.
but I want to just again take a quick step back here and talk a little bit about um, what it is that the UFC actually delivered for Trump, because I think everyone understands that Trump's real sort of dalliance with the UFC is about young male voters. But we have quite a bit of evidence that the UFC actually did deliver quite a lot politically for Trump, both in 2016 and again in the 2024 campaign. Can you talk a little bit about that? And then, secondly, how that relates to his lukewarm reception that he's getting now and what that tells us.
Yeah, I mean, in 2016, it was mostly Dana White's public endorsement of Trump and Trump appearing at UFC events. There was a little bit of um, getting Trump to do, the nascent podcast circuit, but that really came into its own in 2024 when Dana White claims that he said, "Hey, you got to get, on the manosphere." I doubt that Dana White was the architect of that media strategy. I mean, he's working for Ari Emanuel, who is the king of architects of media strategies. Dana White is, and I don't want to diss Dana White. He's a great front man and promoter. He's not as good as he used to be. He's really disengaged. But the guy, at his peak, he knew the fight game. He was passionate about it. He could really sell it. And fans were really, really, really loyal to Dana White. In 2016, if you criticize Dana White, UFC fans of all stripes would come at you. That's much less true now. You can really see the erosion in their fan base caused by this openly partisan commitment to Trump. That it's you see many more UFC fans openly criticizing Dana White now that he's so linked with Donald Trump. But in 2024, they definitely helped Trump execute what seems in retrospect a pretty brilliant media strategy. Got him appearances on Joe Rogan. Kamala Harris infamously did not get on Joe Rogan. Both she and Joe Rogan have said it was the other person's fault, but nonetheless, she didn't do the show. He also did the Nelk Boys, Aiden Ross, yada yada. I mean, just no end of influencers. And this is, one of the things about these guys is they're generally lightweights that don't know anything about what they're talking about. I mean, the Nelk Boys infamously had Benjamin Netanyahu on and literally didn't seem to know there was a genocide going on and acted shocked when people were mad, and later had to have, a Palestinian comedian come on and educate them about what's going on, and turn around and we're like, oh, so we hosted the modern day Hitler, like, wow, guys. And so, it's easy questions. A lot of people are very excited to have the former president on their show and just, kowtowed to him and gave him softballs and handed their audience over to him. And a number of these guys have come out and regretted it. Dave Smith, Theo Vaughn, even Joe Rogan has come out and said some things that he, disagrees with ICE and various things, although he's been back to the White House after that. So yeah, they were definitely a big factor in Donald Trump's media strategy in 2024, and a big part of him garnering so much of the youth and minority vote that nobody expected him to get, that literally put him over the top. But as we've seen, his policies have been incredibly unpopular with that demo. AI destroying entry level jobs or being blamed for destroying entry level jobs certainly hasn't helped. The ICE has gone so far over the top. So many people have disagreed with that. People expected him to be the peace candidate, and obviously the war he started with Iran has debunked that canard. And so, he's definitely lost the support of that audience, and you could see it in that last UFC event in Florida, which if you can't get a pop from a UFC crowd in Florida, you know, that you're in trouble. I mean, this wasn't some blue state. This wasn't Illinois or Chicago or, LA or something. This was Florida, Donald Trump's home state or second home state. And that was a real wake up call. Well, I don't know if it woke anybody up, but it was definitely noted and commented on by people like me that are observing this.
Yeah, and I will say that I'm obsessed enough about these sort of things that I went on Twitter to hear from the people who were actually in the building, and pretty much everyone in the building said what it sounded like on TV is not what it sounded like in the building. So we I think we can understand that there was some clever production work going on there to make sure that it wasn't a total embarrassment for Trump, like last night at the Knicks game was, where the booing was overwhelming to say the least.
Yeah.
Um,
And go ahead.
no, go ahead, Nate.
I was just going to say, and I don't know that there's any reason that the NBA or their production team was working overtime to suppress the booze and
Yeah, and I
cover.
mean, it was ABC and Disney, and they have their own beef with Trump going back a long way. So I'm sure that that was probably the least friendly broadcast he could have been on. But in any event, now, Nate, you've mentioned his name a number of times. So we have to talk about Ari Emanuel. Now, you've mentioned Ari Emanuel in the context of Hollywood, which is the appropriate context, obviously. He is in many ways the king of Hollywood, probably the power broker of 2026, maybe the most important singular person in Hollywood today, or, one of the two or three. Who is Ari Emanuel? And when we say that name, it should sound familiar because we should all be familiar with his brother, Rahm Emanuel. So, Ari Emanuel, Rahm Emanuel, two very influential brothers in Washington, in New York, and in Hollywood. Tell us a little bit about Ari Emanuel, how he enters this picture, and what we really need to know about this guy.
The Emanuels are an interesting family. They come out of Chicago. Their father was a pediatrician, by all accounts, an excellent pediatrician. He was also associated with the Zionist group Irgun, which has frequently been put on terrorist lists. I don't know that Dr. Emanuel had any direct role with terrorist attacks, but it appears he had some sort of financial and or espionage role with that organization. So they're Zionists from way back and in good standing. Rahm goes on to become the chief of staff, first a congressman, a big player in the Clinton administration. Then he's Barack Obama's chief of staff. Then he becomes the mayor of Chicago. Then he's Joe Biden's ambassador to Japan. The thinking was, let's get Rahm as far away as possible. And anybody who could read Japanese knows that Rahm had a disastrous tenure in Japan, lecturing the Japanese on all kinds of woke type issues that they did not regard well. But that hardly reached here, and now he's trying to rehabilitate himself and run for president in 2028, which is going to be a stretch, but hey, anything can happen. Kamala Harris is still the front runner at the party. So, you know, that's one brother. The other brother is Zeke, who is a medical doctor and was one of the architects of Joe Biden's COVID policy. And in classic Emanuel family fashion, he's simultaneously the architect of it and one of its biggest critics. Let's get everybody back to work. Oh, no, no, bad idea to get everybody back to work. Ari Emanuel's the youngest brother. He initially probably is most famous as the inspiration for the character Ari Gold on the HBO show Entourage from the 2000s, which a lot of people have forgotten. But basically, that's a semi-accurate portrayal of him as this hard-charging Hollywood agent, young, aggressive, yelling, cursing, taking big chances, et cetera, and rising to success. And like I said, he did. He forms this agency with Patrick Whitesell in the 90s, sells it to William Morris in 2009, ends up the chair of William Morris through this boardroom chicanery. There's some great articles in Variety where various people who are partners at William Morris are still kind of like processing how did that happen, because it's one of these things like a law firm where the different partners got divided and voted against. They thought for whatever reason, a big enough block of them thought that Ari Emanuel was the guy they should vote for, and they came to regret that. From there, they buy other agencies, the IMG agency, and then in 2016 they buy the UFC. And at the time, and I was one of the people that was very wrong about this. At the time, people thought the $4 billion buyout was a ludicrous price, that they were buying at the peak because Conor McGregor and Ronda Rousey had already kind of crested at that point. They still haven't produced any stars of that magnitude since then. The financing included all kinds of golden parachutes and outs for the key executives if they met some pretty easy to meet metrics. So all the smart money like myself was saying, oh, well, this is, the fix is in, they're just going to meet these metrics, they're going to get these golden parachutes, then they're going to dump it off on the next sucker. But they've been massively successful with it, partly because of COVID. Like during COVID, they were one of the only sporting events going. And this is also at the point 2020 when Hollywood became secondary to Ari Emanuel. And maybe not in his heart, but at his bottom line, because the Endeavor empire nearly died in 2020. As you know, theaters stopped showing movies. There was multiple strikes. Endeavor was at the heart of those strikes because they were trying to not only be an agency but become a production company. And this is one of the things I always say about Ari Emanuel is he loves to be on both sides of the table when deals are negotiated. And he ended up never succeeding in making Endeavor a successful stock. They tried, it took them multiple attempts to get an IPO launched. And then finally, when they did, they had to take it private. And it's funny because the company that included Endeavor and On Location and IMG and the UFC was valued less by the stock market than TKO, which is just the UFC and the WWE. Somehow you take out all these other assets and it's worth more, like twice as much, 3 times as much. And it's just because Wall Street did not get the story. What is Endeavor? How does this add up to anything? Like what does professional bull riding have to do with Hollywood agencies and sports reps and yada, yada, yada. And so Egan Durbin helped them take this private. They bought WWE. They just settled a lawsuit in Delaware, which looked pretty convincing that Endeavor was working secretly with Vince McMahon, who was under considerable distress because he was about to get hit with this civil and criminal suit in this case of sexual harassment and sex trafficking, allegedly, yada, yada, yada. The fact case of which are really damning and horrible for Vince McMahon. And it appears that Nick Khan, formerly of the Creative Artists Association, one of the other big Hollywood agencies, who had gone over to the WWE in the late 2010s, was secretly working with Ari Emanuel to negotiate this deal to buy WWE from Vince behind the back of his family, behind the back of the other shareholders. And they just had to settle a lawsuit because there was so much evidence destruction that the judge literally said, okay, we're going to assume these 5 things are true. And I don't have the 5 things off the top of my head, but they were absolutely damning for TKO, for Vince McMahon, for Nick Khan and Ari Emanuel, that there's clear evidence that they were working together, colluding behind the scenes long before the due diligence was done, long before any other bidders had a chance to buy it. So kind of getting on a tangent there. But one story that I think sums up Ari Emanuel is that he was kind of the rabbi for David Ellison. Now, David Ellison, the son of Larry Ellison, the CEO of Oracle. He's one of 2 Ellison children that spent the 2010s in Hollywood. His sister was much more respected, made a number of successful art movies, but ultimately, it's harder to make money with art movies than it is with Top Gun sequels. David made Top Gun sequels and scored big. And with Daddy's money, he wanted to buy Paramount, which since 22 and the end of the streaming wars, if you look at the stock charts of all of the big Hollywood companies, they were all stratospheric in 2020, 21, 22, because they thought, oh yeah, Hollywood's going to show Netflix how it's done. There's going to be these streaming wars, and Paramount and Peacock and Disney. They're all going to go in there and clean house, run Netflix out of town. And there's going to be this big streaming boom, and all the Hollywood studios are going to be the big winners. None of that happened. The stock price is cratered in 2022. Poor Shari Redstone, who is, it's the lesser known inspiration for the HBO series Succession. Like she, that everybody thinks that's about the Murdoch family, and it largely is, but it's also about the Redstone family. And poor Shari is as close as anybody to the main character in Succession, who continually had the brass ring taken out from under her. Her father, Sumner, who lived to be like 119 or something, was always like, Shari, today you can take over the company. Ah, did I say today? I meant next year, that kind of thing. And poor Shari finally gets the company, and the streaming bubble pops. And so she's, and she's stuck with all these cable channels that nobody wants anymore, that everybody can see. They used to be cash cows, and now they're relentlessly declining. So she's desperate to sell. Ellison's looking to buy, but she didn't want to sell to somebody that wasn't real Hollywood. And there are published accounts of Ari Emanuel being the person that called her and said, Shari, baby, I know David. I know you. I'm Hollywood. You're Hollywood. David's Hollywood too. Look at all these Top Gun sequels he's made. This guy is kosher. Plus, he's a bigger Zionist than you are. So Shari was happy to sell and sell to the Ellisons. And then there was another hurdle to be cleared with Donald Trump. Now, the Ellisons and a lot of the coverage is like, oh, Larry Ellison's the closest executive to Donald Trump. He's MAGA's MAGA. He was there in 2016, blah, blah, blah. And that's true. But he also abandoned Trump after January 6th, and backed Tim Scott in the 2024 primary and gave to some Democrats in the meantime. And so that's the kind of thing Trump remembers, even in his currently diminished state. He remembers when somebody abandons ship and screws him over. It's documented fact that David Ellison was a guest of Ari Emanuel, not Dana White, a guest of Ari Emanuel cage side at 2 UFC events that Donald Trump attended. And at one of those 2 events, Ellison and Trump were seen getting into a bit of a heated discussion. And Ari Emanuel was seen coming over, putting his arm around both men and calming the waters. So we know that Ari Emanuel helped negotiate getting Trump's support for Skydance to buy Paramount. And then again was helpful getting Trump's support for Paramount to then buy WBD. And you might recall that Trump was cozying up to Reed Hastings from Netflix, and I might have to read whatever from Netflix. But Trump was kind of playing it both sides of the street, but ultimately went with WBD. And there's every indication that Ari Emanuel was a key backer of WBD getting that. And in fact, there was a Variety article that was only in print for one day that was the first to report that the sovereign wealth funds of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE were all investing in Oracle and Paramount's acquisition of WBD. And that article was pulled, although that reporting was later confirmed. And originally it was reporting that those sovereign wealth funds were going to own 25% of the new entity. It's since forms have been filed by WBD saying they might own up to 49%, although there's some other sovereign wealth funds involved as well who are not named. We could speculate who those foreign entities might be, but I don't know. But one thing that's interesting, and I can't find this in the Wayback Machine or anywhere, but at one point there were rumors that it was Jared Kushner and Ari Emanuel who got those 3 countries to invest their sovereign wealth funds into this entity. And anybody who knows anything about Middle Eastern politics knows that the Saudis and UAE tried to blockade Qatar in 2017 with Jared Kushner's help. That's an act of war. The only reason that didn't go forward is that somebody told Kushner, dude, the U.S. has one of our biggest Air Force bases there in Qatar. We cannot be engaged in blockading this country. 2, UAE and Saudi have been very closely allied since Mohammed bin Salman took over as crown prince in 2016 in a violent coup. He's been sort of a mentee of Mohammed bin Zayed of the UAE. However, they have openly fallen out. and have engaged in a proxy war in Yemen in February, where troops working for the Saudis mopped the floor with troops working for the UAE. And since the Iran war, we've seen the UAE come out, quit OPEC, and come out and say, we don't, F our Arab brothers, we're down with Israel and the United States. So anybody who can get the UAE, the Saudis, and Qatar, all three to go in on the same deal, that is some badass geopolitical negotiating right there. And Kushner obviously has a certain cachet as, Trump's son-in-law, but Kushner's not a smart guy. I don't know if you follow, but he just got his ass run out of Albania in a really inspiring popular uprising that ran him right out of that country. Ari Emanuel is a much smarter cat than Jared Kushner. And I suspect that if those two were indeed involved in getting those three quarrelsome Gulf states to all three invest in Warner Brothers Discovery, that it was Ari Emanuel who had the most to do with it. Again, those reports vanished from the web, so I can't confirm that, but that's just the rumors that were going around. So Ari Emanuel is, when I got into covering combat sports, when I left politics to cover combat sports, I was prepared for Don King or Vince McMahon or kind of these super carny kind of guys. I mean, I know they're corrupt, sometimes they're violent, yada, yada, yada. I never expected them to be covering businesses run by the brother of a potential president, somebody's an advisor to a president, somebody who's tight with Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed and is tight enough with the Israelis that he is one of the few Zionists that can openly call for Bibi Netanyahu's resignation. And he's been doing that for 2 years. He's also the first major donor to call for Joe Biden to step down in 2024. And he did that at the Simon Wiesenthal luncheon in Hollywood in front of Jeffrey Katzenberg, the head of DreamWorks, who was the co-chair of the Biden campaign. And the guy who became the scapegoat in Hollywood, like people like George Clooney, personally blamed Katzenberg for, hey, I gave Biden 100 grand. And when I went to the dinner where you're supposed to shake hands and get to take a picture with Biden, he's so senile and isolated, I didn't even get to do that. What do you sold me a bill of goods. Ari Emanuel publicly called out. This was after the debate, but he's the first major Democratic donor to come out and say Biden got to go. And he did that right in front of Katzenberg, who stormed out of the luncheon. And since that point, I'm told that Ari Emanuel is hands down the king, the undisputed king of Hollywood bundlers for Democratic candidates. And the fact that he can do that while his employee and sock puppet Dana White is more closely associated with Donald Trump than almost any public figure is just staggering to me. And nobody will talk about it because Ari Emanuel is a guy you don't want to cross. And even some of the best journalists in MMA that lean to the left are reluctant to talk about him because, unlike me, they still have careers. And, Ari Emanuel not only manages talent through WME, but if your talent and you're not currently represented by WME, I guarantee you're going to be negotiating with somebody who is. Maybe the next director on the film you want to get, maybe the showrunner on the next TV series you want to land, maybe the talking heads that are going to review your next movie. They manage Stephen A. Smith, Pat McAfee. You never know who they're managing. I mean, we know that he's associated with Larry David and Ben Stiller. But these relationships come and go. I mean, they might represent people on one deal. Oh God, who's the legendary quarterback from the New England Patriots? Tom Brady. Tom Brady, they didn't represent as a sports agent, but they did represent in other capacities, right? So you're like trying to research this stuff, and you're like, well, who represents Tom Brady? Oh, it's this guy. It's not WME. And then, whoa, lo and behold, there's another deal, and WME is helping him sign. For a while, he had this stupid touch football league that was getting funded by the Saudis, and WME was all behind that. So Ari Emanuel, and they manage tons of influencers as well. And even the ones they don't manage, like Aiden Ross has a massive deal with the UFC. So they might as well manage him. I mean, his bread is buttered on the WME side. So Ari Emanuel has this just incredible soft power. Like nothing I've ever seen.
I think that Ari Emanuel, much like the TKO group that he fronts, I mean, it could be understood as a monopoly man. This is a man whose function at the sort of professional level is to establish and further cement the monopolies that he can control, or the monopolies that need to be controlled by his friends, who he can then influence, like the Ellisons or whomever else. I mean, this is somebody whose basically entire function is the sort of agglomeration of power and the sort of squeezing out of anyone else who wants to get a piece of power. Now, the reason why I wanted to highlight Emmanuel, though, is because in many ways, as you just laid out, Nate, he is almost a metaphor for the overlap between sports, entertainment, politics, geopolitics, and the global economic situation. And to understand how all of these things overlap is to understand really everything that's going on around us. You can't understand the combat sports and the entertainment world if you don't understand the power moves that were made by the Ellisons with Trump's help and so forth. And so I wanted to just ask you, if you could elaborate what you think this means about culture in the United States. What does it mean about American culture, entertainment? What does it tell us about the shifting landscape of power in that sphere?
It's fascinating because it's taking place at a time in which the ground is shifting under everyone's feet. The Ari Emanuel of 10 or 20 years ago is a very different animal than the Ari Emanuel of today. Today, he's a billionaire because of his investment in WWE and UFC. Nobody 10 years ago would have told you that was Ari Emanuel's future. Everybody would have thought Ari Emanuel is going to be the king of Hollywood. And if he becomes a billionaire, it's going to be because he took over a major studio, or he's turned Endeavor into a studio in its own right. But instead, Hollywood is essentially imploded. Not only has theatrical not recovered from COVID, but culturally, we are no longer exporting our culture to China, for example, in the way that we used to. China makes their own movies now. Nobody wants Hollywood crap. Ari Emanuel was one of the key drivers of the decision to sort of Disneyfy all of Hollywood and make everything a blockbuster. It's all got to be Harry Potter, Star Wars, Marvel Comics Universe, sequel, sequel, sequel. Forget, middle of the road movies, forget comedies, forget movies made for moms and 45-year-olds. It's all about teenage boys. It's all about superheroes. It's all about franchises. And they just ran the fucking thing into the ground. And at the same time, he's smart and savvy enough to see that sports were going to be a high value property in the streaming environment. It's the only thing that has to be live, basically. It's the last appointment viewing. We all grew up in an era when, hell, Johnny Carson was appointment viewing. If you wanted to watch the news, you had to watch it at 6 p.m. or 10 p.m., basically. We've been on a 24-hour news cycle for 30 years, et cetera. The internet has changed all that. At the same time, his politics are very stuck in the 90s. This is a Bill Clinton Democrat. This is a guy who came to power at the same time that the neocons took over our foreign policy. And he is a guy who operated for decades in an environment where if you even said that the Emanuel brothers are Zionists, you'd get hit with the anti-Semitism flag and you'd be canceled faster than Norman Finkelstein, right? And now because of the genocide Israel has committed in Gaza with US financing, with the backing of Joe Biden and Donald Trump, administration, same shit, different administration. Now everybody, you can't deny it anymore, even though AIPAC is in some ways more powerful than ever, as we see by them driving Thomas Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene out of Congress and currently trying to cut Graham Plattner off at the knees in Maine, trying to destroy Al Sayed in Michigan. There's still this very powerful force, but they've lost their secret weapon, which was it was verboten to discuss Israeli influence on American politics. Even though people like Steve Walt and John Mearsheimer, wrote the book The Israel Lobby, definitively proved that they had disproportionate power. I mean, Russiagate was this giant hoax, but Israelgate is the real deal. And there's no end of evidence for it. And you see things where somebody will be dinged as an anti-Semite, And then they'll be having, some sort of Jewish organizational conference, and they'll say all the same stuff that they just called somebody else an anti-Semite for saying. Like Sarah Hurwitz, the former Obama speechwriter, who came up with "When they go low, we go high" and all that. I remember her media tour from last fall, where she's literally saying, "Oh, all these young Jewish kids learned the wrong lesson from all this Holocaust education we gave them. They learned that it's not about whether Jews are being killed or doing the killing. It's about big people hurting little people. That's the wrong message." It's so weird to see, And so Ari Emanuel's operating now in this new context, and you see it sometimes in the UFC. Like they had a fighter, Bryce Mitchell, still fights for the UFC, who's one of the beneficiaries of their vaunted free speech policy, which literally let him get away with saying something to the tune of, Hitler wasn't all bad and maybe he'd be a good guy to go fishing with. Just complete moronic drivel. And Bryce Mitchell's the guy who literally ripped off his scrotum with a power drill at one point. So we're not dealing with the brightest bulb on the string. But after he made his Hitler remarks on a podcast, the UFC decided to go in on that. And they booked him and they hyped him and they booked him against a guy named Gene Silva, a Brazilian fighter who's a huge Bolsonaro supporter and a huge Zionist. And Ari Emanuel was cage side thinking that the fans would root for the Zionists, Nazi bad, Zionist good. But instead, Bryce Mitchell ended up being the babyface of the situation and got most of the fan support. And it's such a weird environment to see people like Bryce Mitchell or Sean Strickland or former fighter Jake Shields that are people that I've observed for a long time. I think to varying degrees, Strickland is definitely just a ridiculous sexist and homophobe. Jake Shields is a absolute anti-Semite, super racist, was horrible all through Black Lives Matter. And yet all three of these guys are anti-genocide. It's just like, it's this head scrambling moments. Like when you find yourself agreeing more with Marjorie Taylor Greene about Israel than you do with AOC, and you've even seen Jake Shields and Sean King, the infamous BLM grifter, come out and bro down on Twitter because they're both against the genocide in Israel. What do you do with this? It's like, oh, here's two people I think are absolutely horrible politically, and they're uniting to fight for the most important cause on the planet today. I just don't know what to do with it. But it's not good politics for Ari Emanuel, is the point I'm trying to make, where they've lost a little bit of the control of the narrative. And I wonder with this UFC White House event, if they get how unpopular Trump is becoming, especially with their key demo. And they just bought in, like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and every other corporate leader. Trump's the winner. We're on Team Trump. Go Trump. And they haven't quite got it yet that's not working. And or he thinks I can just sock puppet this and simultaneously support my brother or maybe Josh Shapiro or John Ossoff for the Democratic presidential candidate in 2028 and secretly support the Republican through Dana White and nobody will catch me at it. Or they view the UFC as a disposable property because their real game is to be NFL owners. Ari Emanuel and his COO, Mark Shapiro, along with Egan Durbin of Silver Lake, just became minority owners in the Las Vegas Raiders. Ari Emanuel has talked about owning an NFL or NBA franchise for decades. This is where he wants to be. This is not a guy who wants to be introduced as the owner of the WWE or the owner of UFC, the king of cage fighting. He's the king of Hollywood. And if he has to move into sports because Hollywood's essentially dead, he'd much rather be there with the marquee NFL brand. And
Well,
so
that actually raises the final subject that I really want to address with you, Nate, and that is when you say Ari Emanuel wants to be the king of sports or the king of combat sports or the king of Hollywood, and I say Ari Emanuel's entire framework for how he does business is the establishment and furtherance of monopoly control. That then leads us to this other issue, which we now see Ari Emanuel and his minions pushing in boxing, which is the so-called Ali Reform Act, the Muhammad Ali Reform Act, or
Boxing
that is
Revival Act.
Boxing Revival Act. The Muhammad Ali Act is something that has been on the books for several decades now. Ari Emanuel, Dana White, and their various minions are working very hard to strip away the labor protections that exist within that legislation, to change it in various ways. Can you explain what the Ali Act is, what they're trying to do, and then I guess most importantly, tie that back to this question of monopoly control and what these bastards are really doing?
Okay, so the Muhammad Ali Boxing Act was something that John McCain and Muhammad Ali worked on about 25 years ago that gave boxers a great deal of protection, that prevented promoters from managing their own belts. You had to have a neutral sanctioning body to give titles. It limited the exclusive and lengths of contracts that promoters could lock in fighters with. Like the UFC has a championship clause where if you win the title, you essentially can never get out of your contract. Boxing's not allowed to do that because of the Muhammad Ali Act. They also can't manage and promote fighters at the same time. There have been some entities that have done workarounds with that, but the law is you can't be a promoter and a manager at the same time. Also, they have to be transparent about how much revenue, both TV media and gate revenue, is coming in to the event so that the boxers and their managers know how big the pie they're slicing up is. That has led to situations like people like Canelo Alvarez or Floyd Mayweather, Manny Pacquiao, getting up to 75, 80, sometimes even 90% of the revenue. It's like they're Led Zeppelin, right? Like telling people how it's going to be in the rock and roll business. Like, we are the stars, we're getting the vast majority of the money. In the UFC, fighters get less than 15% of the revenue. TKO has talked endlessly about how that was one of the most appealing things to them when they bought the business. They love that. Since they've taken over the WWE, they've fired any number of performers and forced other performers to take up to 50% pay cuts. And currently, they've formed an entity called Zuffa Boxing that's 60% funded by a company called Sela, SELA, that's owned by the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, that wants to do boxing the way they do UFC. And simultaneously, they're lobbying for this Muhammad Ali Boxing Revival Act. They even got Ali's widow to support this. They got Ilhan Omar to support this. This basically allows them to create an entity called a UBO that's exempt from all the requirements of the Ali Act. So they can be the promoter and the manager. They can keep the amount of revenue secret from the fighters. They can lock fighters into championship clauses. Like I saw Ilhan Omar sitting there saying, a 6-year contract's not that big a deal for a fighter. Like, lady, that's 90% of somebody's career in that business. I mean, that's like saying, oh, 6 years isn't that big a time in the career of an OnlyFans performer. Lady, that's all she's got. The youth, the power, the physicality, that goes fast. So boxers have very short careers, and they're lobbying this so massively. There were 2 hearings when it went through the House, and it passed overwhelmingly by voice vote. Only one Democrat stood up against it, a guy from Massachusetts. I can't remember his name. I apologize. And I was told by reporters who were at those hearings that there were more lobbyists in the room than reporters and Congress critters combined. And the word that we heard from TKO was that they were pissed when the thing didn't pass in one day. Like, they're so checked out of how dysfunctional Congress is. They think it's the Tom DeLay era when, it might have been bad legislation, but legislation got passed. Mike Johnson can't pass jack, right? The only time they can pass a bill is it's one of these huge omnibus bills. That they did get it through the House. Now it's in the Senate, in the trusted hands of Ted Cruz, everybody's favorite, Israel's number one senator. And it looks like it's all set to just pass right through. And the other thing they're doing here that's super shady is they're openly partnering with Sela, which is Saudi money, for 60% of the backing. And they're doing these like warehouse events. They've signed a few high profile fighters, but basically they're just trying to grind out slop content, low tier fighters signed at the beginning of their career. But this other guy, Turki al-Sheikh, who's also Saudi, who is one of the goons who literally intimidated the former crown prince into signing away his title at MBS, a guy who grew up with MBS, watching WWE and playing video games together. Turki al-Sheikh has become this sort of daddy warbucks of boxing over the past 3 years. And he's booked fights with Tyson Fury, the heavyweight champion Usyk. He got, Wilder back in there. He got the former UFC heavyweight champ Francis Ngannou into boxing. He got, kickboxing champ into boxing. Got him a fight with Usyk, Rico Verhaven, just a couple weeks ago. And he's just throwing this money out wildly and obvious flops. Like he held an event in Times Square and did not book the permissions from the city to have an audience. So they had an event in Times Square, but they had to build a giant fence around it so nobody could see it. Like this is obviously a money losing debacle. But it served as sort of, again, the Ari Emanuel style. Turkey Al Sheikh's over here buying out all the big contracts and putting all the big fights on, which really hurts the other promoters because they're not putting on those big fights. And then on the other hand, Zuffa partnered with Sella, another Saudi entity. I mean, Turkey doesn't have any money of his own. It's all Saudi money. It's all MBS's money. It's a mafia family that runs a country. And one dude runs the mafia family. And so they've got this, this pincer attack coming at boxing. On the one hand, you've got Riyadh season, which is Turkey Al Sheikh's thing, which sometimes TKO will partner with. Like the few times that Turkey has put on a successful fight, like the Canelo Terrence Crawford fight, it was promoted by TKO who know what they're doing. And the rest of the time, when he's screwing up and doing things like the stupid Times Square thing, TKO isn't there to help. Meanwhile, they're over here slowly but surely on a 5 or 10 year plan to monopolize the sport by signing up young talent, by cutting deals with USA Boxing. That's caused big political brouhahas, and multiple board members of USA Boxing have been forced out because allegedly because they were resisting this TKO takeover. So it's this, insidious climb to monopolize boxing. Meanwhile, they're partnering or keeping at arm's length from Turkey, who's, throwing the stupid money around and signing up the biggest stars of today while they sign up the big stars of tomorrow. So it's one of the most insidious things I've ever seen. And I view them as like private equity. Like I'm sure you've noticed that your local vet or funeral home is like the mortician you used to know is not there anymore. Or every time you go to the vet, it's a different vet. And suddenly x-rays are 7 times as expensive as they used to be. And they're really hard selling you. Your cat needs chemo, that kind of crap. That's what they've done to combat sports. They've relentlessly eroded the quality of the product. They've relentlessly raised the prices. And they've relentlessly gotten more and more money out of governments like San Antonio, Perth, Australia, St. Louis, to give them what they call site fees, where you have to pay the UFC to come to town. And this is a sport that was built, in Laramie, Wyoming, and Des Moines, Iowa, and all these, and the same with the WWE and the same with boxing. These are grassroots people sports that were built in places like Amarillo, Texas, and Tallahassee, Florida. And now you've got TKO COO Mark Shapiro being like, we're not going to spend so much time in the B and C markets. And if you want to bring us to a B and C market, you better be ready to pay the big site fee. And now they're signing this deal with the State Department. So God knows, this could be like a McDonnell Douglas level deal. I have no idea. It could be nothing. I mean, it's the Trump administration. You never know when they're stealing $1 billion and when they're just talking crap and there's no actual money involved. But yeah, it's staggering. It's not anything I ever expected to be dealing with covering combat sports.
I think what we're really talking about here is a creeping effort to monopolize, while simultaneously a form of soft power projection from the Gulf states, who have spent several decades amassing these hundreds of billions of dollars in their wealth funds, and they're ready to use it. So you see, kind of these things overlapping: power projection from the Gulf, erosion of U.S. soft power, the sort of merging of capital with Gulf capital, with U.S. entertainment. And it's all in some ways kind of distilled, almost like epitomized in this UFC White House card. It's like the most sort of disgusting distillation of all of these processes at the same time.
And we haven't even mentioned that, a Russian named Kirill Dmitriev might own a chunk of the UFC, and they've got deals with China. So even during this, nascent World War III that's going on, somehow Ari Emanuel is working both sides of the streets. It's like Ford or IBM working with Adolf Hitler in the late 1930s or 1940s. This is a guy who can do business with virtually anybody and will. At one point after MSB allegedly murdered Adnan Khashoggi, the Washington Post reporter, Ari Emanuel made a huge deal about how I gave that asshole $400 million back. And I had to double my bodyguard staff because the Saudis are so scary. That was 2018, something like that. By 2020, 2021, they're just bros again. It's all water. It's all just blood under the bridge. Just get the hose out, wash the blood off the garage floor, and get back to business like Tony Soprano. It's really something to see.
Exactly. And this is not so much about sports. This is about the way in which these various power players around the world have used this as a sort of an entry point to their own sort of soft power. And that all relates to the geopolitical issues that we're seeing playing out in the Gulf. We've seen this in many other instances. Let's not forget the sort of dividing lines between Iran, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the shifting alliances, all of this distilled through the sort of prism of US entertainment culture. We've seen this in golf with Live Golf. We've seen this with the combat sports. We're seeing this in soccer or football. We with, by the way, Turkey Al Sheikh bought and then he was humiliated in Egypt after trying to buy and own a football club there. So all of these things are connected. If you don't care about the sports, irrelevant. These are all tied to the political scene that we're all living through now.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're upset about what's happening to 60 Minutes or something like that, nobody's as responsible. I mean, maybe three or four people are more responsible than Ari Emanuel, but Ari Emanuel is one of the top five players in making that happen because he's totally down with their Zionist agenda. And it's not some kind of MAGA agenda. The Ellisons are not quote unquote conservatives. They are Zionists and tech bros. They're about the data centers, the AI, the surveillance, and exporting the Gaza model to the rest of the planet, I'm afraid. And, Ari Emanuel is one of the key facilitators of making all that happen.
Nate Wilcox is the editor in chief of the MMA Draw. Follow the MMA Draw on Substack. Get your subscriptions. I'm a subscriber. I would recommend it. It's one of the best resources you will find if you're interested either in combat sports on the one hand, or the way that all of these things tie to the economics and the politics, which is really kind of where MMA Draw really hits the mark. He was the founder of BloodyElbow.com. I would recommend you follow Nate Wilcox on Substack and all over social media. Nate, thanks for coming on CounterPunch.
Thanks so much, Eric. It's an honor.
Everyone, thank you as always. We'll talk to you again real soon.